The atmosphere inside the Los Angeles County courtroom was heavy, so tense you could almost feel it pressing down. Rows of observers filled the gallery, murmuring softly as they watched what looked like a one-sided trial unfold. At the defense table stood a young man who barely looked old enough to vote. Hands in his pockets, expression calm, he held his ground like someone with nothing left to lose. His name was Jalen Dawson, 19 years old. The charges: grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Serious accusations. But anyone watching Judge Walter Grayson could tell this wasn't just about legalities. Not to him. Grayson was sizing him up like a problem kid who wandered too far out of line. Leaning back in his chair, the judge let his fingers tap an idle rhythm on the armrest. His eyes narrowed, glasses perched low on his nose. Then he spoke, dry sarcasm lining every syllable. "So what are you now, some kind of courtroom prodigy?" His tone dripped condescension. "This isn't a school debate, son." That drew a round of snickers from the court staff, bailiff, stenographer, even the prosecutor cracked a smile. They thought this was going to be easy. They thought they already knew how this would end. Jalen didn't smile. Didn't flinch. He stood still, gaze steady, like someone who had lived this moment 1,000 times in his mind. Because, in a way, he had. While other kids spent afternoons glued to video games, Jalen was in his room reenacting courtroom scenes. While his friends memorized football stats, he studied landmark decisions and criminal procedure. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 2 decades, and her dinner table stories became his earliest education. He knew how justice worked and how it didn't. By the time he was a teenager, Jalen could dissect a trial transcript like a professional. But none of that mattered to Judge Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another case number with an attitude problem. "Let's move this along," Grayson muttered, flipping open the folder on his bench. "I've got a tea time in 2 hours." That earned more chuckles from the crowd. But this time, something shifted. Jalen's mouth curved into a barely visible smile. The kind you might miss if you weren't paying attention. Because the judge had just made his first mistake and Jalen saw it. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose from his seat with all the arrogance of a man who had never lost. His suit was sharp, his stride confident, and his voice rang out like he was reciting from a script. "Your Honor," he began, "the state intends to demonstrate, without any ambiguity, that the defendant Jalen Dawson was apprehended in possession of a stolen vehicle. A black 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just 3 hours prior to his arrest." He paced toward the jury, each step echoing. Officers initiated pursuit through downtown Los Angeles after identifying the stolen vehicle. The suspect Mr. Dawson attempted to evade arrest but was eventually taken into custody. His fingerprints were recovered from the steering wheel. The evidence is both direct and overwhelming. A ripple of movement stirred through the gallery. It sounded airtight. High-speed chase. Physical evidence. Eyewitnesses. Case closed, right? Judge Grayson glanced back at Jalen, then toward the prosecutor. "Continue." Carrington held up a folder, gesturing as he spoke. "We've also submitted sworn testimony from Officer Daniel Ruiz, who observed the defendant in the driver's seat just moments before the attempted escape. The arrest followed standard protocol. There were no errors in procedure." He turned, his eyes locking onto Jalen for the first time. "The defense will probably try to convince you that this is all a mistake. That he is some innocent bystander caught in a bad situation. But let's be real, innocent people don't run." The air turned heavy again. Even those who had doubts now began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin in one hand. "It all sounds very compelling." Most in the courtroom probably agreed. It was an open and shut case. But Jalen wasn't swayed. He had studied too many trials not to see the weaknesses hidden under all the polish. Still, He didn't speak. Not yet. Grayson finally tapped his gavel once. Let us hear the defense now. All eyes turned to Lisa Thornton, the overworked public defender sitting next to Jalen. She hadn't said a word all morning, and from the look on her face, she wasn't eager to start. But that was fine. Because Jalen was already ready to speak for himself. From the moment she entered the courtroom that morning, Lisa Thornton had been visibly uneasy. Now, rising from her seat, she cleared her throat and began, "Your Honor, my client." But Jalen gently touched her elbow, a quiet signal. She looked at him uncertainly before easing back into her chair. Then, for the first time, Jalen spoke directly. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." A hush fell across the room like a curtain. Even the air felt still. Judge Grayson blinked, taken aback. "You'll what?" "I'll be handling my own defense," Jalen said clearly, without hesitation. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The bailiff raised his brows. Prosecutor Carrington let out a quick laugh, short and sharp. "Well, this ought to be entertaining," he muttered. But the amusement didn't last long. Because when Jalen stepped forward, something in the air shifted. He stood tall, calm, letting the silence build until the weight of it began to stir unease in the room. Then, in a firm voice, he turned to address the bench. "Before I begin my defense, Your Honor, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Carrington, arms folded, gave a slight nod. "Go ahead. You stated earlier that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me inside the stolen vehicle, correct?" Carrington gave a dismissive nod. "That's what his report says, and that statement is the foundation of the prosecution's claim." "It's in the file, yes." Jalen turned to Judge Grayson. "Then I formally request that this testimony be struck from the record." Grayson leaned forward, puzzled. "On what basis?" Jalen removed his hands from his pockets and gestured toward the prosecution table. "Because Officer Ruiz couldn't have seen me in the vehicle. He wasn't even present when the chase began." Confusion briefly crossed Carrington's face. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm requesting access to Officer Ruiz's GPS activity from that evening. If he was where he claims, his patrol logs will show it. But," Jalen paused, letting his words settle, "I suspect they'll tell a different story." A ripple spread through the spectators. People sat up straighter. Grayson turned toward Carrington, his tone sharp. "Does the state object to reviewing the officer's GPS records?" Carrington hesitated. "Just long enough. Long enough for the jury to notice. Long enough for the gallery to whisper. Long enough for the judge to narrow his eyes." Jalen didn't gloat. He simply stood, breathing steadily. He had studied too many courtroom tactics not to recognize hesitation when he saw it. "No objections," Carrington finally replied, his voice clipped. But the damage was done. The mood had changed. The smug confidence in the room had vanished. Carrington tried to regain footing. "Even if that officer's location is verified," he said, "the fact remains the defendant's fingerprints were found on the stolen car's steering wheel." Jalen gave a slow nod. "That's true." Then he stepped forward again. "But let's break that down." Grayson waved a hand, giving him space to continue. Jalen turned toward the jury, locking eyes with them one by one. "They want you to believe that because my fingerprints were found in the vehicle, I must have stolen it. But let's apply some logic." He paused, letting the room breathe. "Say you're shopping. You try on a coat. You put your hands in the pockets. Maybe zip it up. Then you hang it back up and leave. Later that day, someone steals that same coat. Would your fingerprints mean you stole it?" A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the back of the gallery murmured under their breath. Jalen didn't stop. The car in question, it was sitting in front of a 7-11 earlier that day. I was there, with 3 friends. As we left, I noticed the Audi sitting there, door already unlocked. I leaned on it. Opened the door. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. Didn't he take it? Didn't he drive it? Didn't he even get inside? He paused again. Then, in a voice that sliced through the courtroom's thick silence, "Does touching something make you a thief?" Carrington flipped through his notes, searching for something to say. But Jalen pressed on. "Let us also talk about how that fingerprint evidence was handled." He turned to the judge. "Was the forensic analyst who processed the prints subpoenaed to testify today?" Grayson hesitated, glancing toward the prosecution. Carrington shifted in place. "No, Your Honor," he said stiffly. Jalen nodded, his voice steady. "So the entire case relies on forensic evidence, and yet the person who analyzed it isn't here. No chance for me to cross-examine, no way to ask about protocol or verify how those samples were collected and stored." Grayson sat back, rubbing his temple. The cracks in the case were becoming impossible to ignore. But Jalen wasn't finished. He took another slow step forward. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a statement made by the registered owner of the vehicle in question, Mr. Raymond Whitaker." Grayson squinted. "The owner of the Audi?" "Yes, sir," Jalen said. "He gave a statement to the police the night of the incident. Oddly, it was left out of the prosecution's materials." He turned to Carrington. "Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers when his car was taken?" Carrington's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Jalen didn't wait. He retrieved a page from his folder and began to read. "I left the engine running while I ran into the gas station. When I came out, the car was gone. I saw the kid take it. It wasn't the guy they arrested. The kid I saw was white." A collective gasp broke through the courtroom. Jalen held up the transcript. "That statement, it's from the original police report. The one the state never submitted. The one that directly contradicts their entire narrative." He looked back to the judge. "And the arresting officer, he conveniently left it out of his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet here we are, me on trial, despite not even fitting the description." Carrington stood abruptly, trying to salvage ground. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was found connected to the stolen vehicle." But Jalen didn't let him finish. "No, I wasn't." His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. Cutting. Precise. "I was picked up blocks away from where the car was ditched. I was walking home from the store with friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't running. The only thing connecting me to this case is a lazy investigation and convenient profiling." The judge let out a breath. Slowly. He pinched the bridge of his nose. The gallery was stone silent now. The jury watched without blinking. And Carrington was no longer hiding his panic. Jalen turned back to the jury box, his tone somber. "The real suspect disappeared that night. But when the police saw a black teenager walking nearby, they decided that was close enough. That's the real story here." Silence hung like fog. Judge Grayson cleared his throat and looked at the prosecutor. "Does the state wish to present anything else?" Carrington, stiff as stone, shook his head. "No, Your Honor." The judge glanced at the jury, then returned his gaze to Jalen. He sat back, voice low but clear. "Case dismissed." The courtroom froze. Then the reaction hit: whispers, shock, a few gasps. Some faces lit with quiet triumph. Others stared in disbelief. Reporters scribbled furiously. The gallery buzzed. But Jalen stood still, letting it all wash over him. Judge Grayson still gripped his gavel tightly. His eyes met Jalen's one last time, his look unreadable. But something in it had changed. Not quite regret. Not quite admiration. But something close. He hadn't seen it before, not clearly. But now, as Judge Grayson looked at Jalen, something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition. Maybe even a trace of regret. Jalen caught the look, held it for just a second. Then he turned and began walking toward the exit. But before he could reach the doors, the judge called out, "Mr. Dawson." Jalen paused but didn't turn around. Grayson hesitated, then said in a voice quieter than before, "You might want to think about law school." A slight smirk crossed Jalen's face. He didn't need to think about it. He was already heading there. Outside the courthouse, the air was buzzing with noise. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing like lightning, microphones shoved forward as if they were weapons. "Jalen, did you expect the case to be dropped? How does it feel to outsmart a senior prosecutor? What's your next move?" Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head, tuning them out. He wasn't here to feed the media frenzy. This wasn't about showing off, or headlines. This was about something deeper. At the bottom of the courthouse stairs, his mother, Denise, stood waiting with her arms folded. Her face gave away nothing. Not anger. Not relief. Just stillness. They looked at each other in silence. Then finally, she let out a breath and said, "Boy, you about gave me a heart attack." Jalen laughed softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Had to take a chance, Ma." She studied him another moment. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "You've always done things your own way," she murmured. "But you did good." The cameras kept snapping, voices shouting over each other, but Jalen didn't hear them anymore. Across the street, Judge Grayson leaned against his car, watching. He wasn't standing the same way he had that morning. His shoulders were lower, his eyes more thoughtful. The smugness was gone. This had been routine for him at first. Just another defendant. Another case to check off. But now he'd remember this one. Because Jalen had done what few ever managed to do, he made the system stop and actually look at itself. And for once, it blinked. There's a bigger truth hidden in that moment. How many cases like this had been rushed, how many people were sitting behind bars, not because of real proof, but because of flawed assumptions, lazy investigations, or unchecked bias. Jalen had knowledge on his side. He had courage. But what about those who didn't? This wasn't just one young man clearing his name. It was a spark. A sign that something broken could still be challenged and changed. Jalen knew now what his next step had to be. That courtroom wouldn't be the last one he entered. But the next time he walked through those doors, he wouldn't be standing at the defense table. He'd be walking in as counsel. And he wouldn't be the only one. Because if this story made you pause, if it made you think, then pass it on. The justice system may be built on laws, but it's driven by people. And people can choose to do better. But only if we make them. So hit that like button, subscribe if you believe stories like this matter, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because next time, it might not be Jalen. It might be someone you love.